said that we're all from different cultures in one way or another, but some more than others. And I think we have a lot to learn from each other. I obviously have to draw attention to this book, which is Death and Bereavement Across Cultures, which I had the pleasure of editing. It was interesting. I think when we went into this, I had the idea that we'd produce a sort of cookery book which would tell you what all Muslims believe or what all Hindus do when somebody dies. And what I actually discovered while we were in the process of writing this book was that there are just as many different kinds of Hindu or Muslim as there are Christian. And among the people who come as refugees or as immigrants to other parts of the world, there's an enormous range from people who want to leave their culture behind and in a sense become absorbed as rapidly as possible into the world they're now entering, to people who cling to their parent culture and don't want to change anything. So we have to respect those differences. There are some people who suggest that grief is a universal experience, and I suppose there is something in the word grief that implies that we all experience something similar. But I think it's a mistake to assume that just because I've experienced a loss in my own life that I understand your loss. We may have something in common, but we shouldn't assume that it is the same. Equally, people from different cultures grieve in totally different ways, which sometimes encourages people to say, well, we have nothing to offer. They have to be helped by their own. And that too I believe to be an error. In fact, as I said earlier, when people are explaining themselves to us, they're also explaining themselves to themselves. And I think this business of crossing cultural boundaries is often very therapeutic. It's good for me and it's good for you. So I don't necessarily close my eyes, while recognizing the gulf that may need to be crossed and the fact that it may take time to cross it, particularly if people don't speak the same language. That doesn't mean to say that we shouldn't try and that we don't have something to offer each other. I'm going to talk a bit about mourning customs, which vary a great deal, nature of attachments that vary a great deal, childrearing practices, rituals attending death and bereavement, and religious beliefs about death and bereavement, all of which are important factors. One of the biggest differences between cultures is in the extent to which people feel permitted to show feelings. There are many parts of the world where, when somebody dies, you don't cry. Among Apache Indians, for instance, I was talking to an Apache GP who said, oh yes, when an Apache parent dies, you never mention their name again. And I said, oh, that's interesting. I said, do you see any problems perhaps resulting from this inhibition of grief? Oh, he said, yes, I do. He said 6 months later they get depressed for no reason. So, in that particular culture it may be that there is an increased risk of depression after bereavement. He certainly said it was one of the commoner psychiatric problems that he met as a GP. One shouldn't idealize other cultures. They may get it right, they may not. We shouldn't judge them either, shouldn't denigrate them. Just because something is culturally normal, that doesn't mean to say it can't also be problematic. An interesting, there haven't been very many adequate cross-cultural studies of bereavement, but one was carried out by Irena Burgoyne, who compared a group of Bahamian widows with a group of London widows using the same questionnaires that I developed, and found some major differences between them. She found that although in the first few months of bereavement, the Bahamian widows showed much more overt distress, grief, mourning, all kinds of feelings. And she described to me the sort of typical Bahamian funeral where part of the priest's role was to whip up emotion in the congregation, both sadness but also triumph. Hallelujah! And there would be people rolling on the floor, crying, enormous expressions of feelings. 9 to 13 months later, Burgoyne found that they had much less difficulty in accepting the loss. They were now less preoccupied with thoughts of the dead spouse and less restless than the London widows, and those were all statistically significant differences. So it does appear that in that culture, at any way, this was an interesting cultural difference, which didn't seem to increase the burden on bereaved people. Rwanda and Burundi seem to be the only two countries in Africa which don't show grief. I visited Rwanda a year after the massacres and attended a mass burial ceremony. We drove with the cortege through the city, and I didn't see a single person crying. It was quite extraordinary, even quite small children standing at the side of the road as the coffins, thousands of dead, were taken. And when I talked to them about this, they were quite proud. It was a nation at war with itself, you know, and they were saying, "You're not going to make me cry." There was a certain triumph about not crying, but it did create quite a problem, particularly for the children, as I say, in the therapy groups which they set up. That seemed to be one of the problems that gradually you could see them thawing out over the process of recovery. I'm always a bit worried about white people coming into black countries and telling them how they ought to grieve. And I think it was very important that in Rwanda, we were actually using Rwandan therapists. We were working very closely with them. We were telling them a bit about what we do, but we weren't imposing a model which didn't make any sense to them.